So, inclusion or exclusion? Do we include others or do we exclude them? I believe that excluding others is at the heart of many, if not most, of the problems that we experience in this world. I read a short story in either high school or college. I can't remember either the title or the author, so maybe there's an English major that can let me know afterwards. But I do remember the plot. It was about the last two human beings on Earth, the last survivors after years of warfare, one side killing the other side. The last war was between people who had freckles and the people who had no freckles. After centuries of intermarriage, it was hard to tell who had freckles in their DNA and who did not. These last two humans were an old married couple. He somehow discovered that his wife was 1/8 freckled, while he himself had not a drop of freckled blood in his body. He could not stand living with a freckled person, so he killed her. This is a story. I didn't make this up. Okay. Later that evening, he sat down and ate the soup that his wife had made for him the day before he took her life. Unbeknown to him, his now deceased wife had learned of his non-freckled heritage. And she poisoned the soup because she could not stand living with a non-freckled person. And there were no human beings left on the face of the earth. Well, for some perverse reason, we human beings have a problem with people who are different from us, which basically means that each of us, to one degree or another, has a problem with everybody. And we tend to, in some way, exclude those who are not like us and therefore not as good as us in some way, shape, or form. Now, when it happens on a global scale, it leads to terrible violence and war. That's an undeniable truth. When it happens on a national scale, we see national strife, sometimes even violence, as we all know too well. And when it happens closer to home, like in a family or a marriage or a friendship, we see an erosion of relationships. Excluding the other because of some difference, real or perceived, leads to really bad things. And this exclusion of the other has many ugly faces, often an ism of some kind. Racism, if we exclude somebody because of their skin color. Sexism, if it's because of their gender. Classism, if it's because of their economic or social status. Fundamentalism, for those who have rigid notions about how to interpret the Bible. We in the United States pride ourselves in being an inclusive country. And I suppose we are in many ways, especially when compared to totalitarian states elsewhere. But an honest look at our history reveals that we are not as inclusive as we like to think we are. Now, would all of you who are women over the age of 18 please raise your hands? Okay, look around. We got a lot of hands up there. Okay, put them down. Okay. How many of you are registered to vote? Pretty good. Okay. And how many, okay, and you know where I'm going with this. Okay, if this election was in 1919, you did not have the right to vote. You were disenfranchised, you were excluded from this civic right and responsibility solely because you were a woman. Now that was just 103 years ago, that election, before the 19th Amendment to our Constitution. And you have to live on another planet if you didn't know about the exclusion of people in this country because of the color of their skin or their race. Now, the 15th Amendment to our Constitution gave formerly enslaved people the right to vote after the Civil War freed them in 1865, okay? It took the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act 100 years after the end of the Civil War for people of color to have their right to vote enforced by the Attorney General of the United States. 100 years. Segregation, that's another form of exclusion. It was and it is very real, even in these United States of ours. In the city of University City, just north and east of WashU's campus, there's a neighborhood association that had a bylaw that prohibited house owners from selling to a black family. Now, see if you can guess when that odious regulation was removed from the association's bylaws. 1994. Now, it wasn't enforceable, but it was not removed. It was still in the books. So how's that for progress? Huh? Now, there's another form of exclusion you don't often hear about in a homily, and it's about how people are excluded in religious institutions, including our own Catholic Church. A church I can critique because it's a church I love and it's a church that I serve. Now, I'm not singling out and picking on Catholics. I happen to be one of them, okay? But we, like other churches, discriminate and exclude. Unlike our Episcopalian and Lutheran cousins in faith, just to name a few, we exclude women from ordination. Now, there are reasons and explanations for this that some of you buy and some of you don't. And it's not my purpose this morning to go into all of that and to have this homily drag on for 3 hours. All right. I'm just pointing out a fact. Women are excluded from ordination. And as we all know, we exclude people who do not belong to our church from receiving Holy Communion. And once again, I'll leave the explanation and the defense of that to others. And that would add even more hours to this homily, okay? And then you'd exclude me, so. Okay. And we do something similar with who can and who cannot marry in the Catholic Church. Now, we all know, I think, some divorced and remarried Catholics who are excluded from full participation in the church they love and are hurt by. And I'll stop here and point out I'm not publicly attacking or defending these prohibitions, these exclusions. So you don't have to report me to the Archbishop and have me defrocked, okay? That's ecclesial exclusion, defrocking, okay? Now, I'm simply stating the obvious. Perhaps these things could change in another 100 years, but the church changes more slowly than the state. So where am I going with this homily, with all of this? Well, our first reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah has God saying this through the prophet. I come to gather nations of every language. Now, that's a very inclusive statement for something that was written in the 8th century BC. The Judeo-Christian religions have an exceptionally long history in wrestling with the exclusion of the other. Exclude the foreigner on one hand, and on the other hand, welcome the stranger. And if I had another 3 Sundays to preach, I'd show you how this wrestling match is played out in our sacred scriptures. It's really fascinating. It was Jesus himself who revolutionized his religion by preaching inclusion instead of exclusion. Now, today's reading from Luke's Gospel, that was what was behind this kind of weird question you heard that was posed to Jesus. Lord, will only a few people be saved? Now, if you study the context of that particular gospel, you know that the questioner assumed that the kingdom of God was solely for the Jews and the Gentiles were SOL, which is a biblical term for solely out of luck. Okay. Or something like that. Okay. I've studied these things. I know that. And sadly, we who call ourselves Christians since biblical times have practiced the same kind of narrow-minded exclusion. So now that I made you totally depressed about all this, I'm going to try to take it in a different direction. Inclusion and exclusion are each reflected in love and hate. Inclusive people are loving people, and exclusive people generally become hateful people. The more inclusive a person becomes, the more loving they get, and the more exclusive a person becomes, the more hateful they get. In a word, we become what we practice. So what do I mean by this? Let me try to explain a bit. So the key here is to look at the underlying traits of a loving, inclusive person as opposed to a hateful and exclusive person. Because these traits get expressed in behaviors that are loving, inclusive, or hateful and exclusive. And the more one behaves and acts in a loving or inclusive manner, the more he or she becomes a loving and inclusive person. There are certain things that you see in a loving, inclusive person, how they live their lives. Now, primarily and most importantly, you see that they choose love over hate. Now, Martin Luther King had this to say about that, and I quote, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." One decides to be one way or the other, to practice certain behaviors over the other. The loving and inclusive person chooses affirmation over defamation, acceptance over rejection, generosity over greed and stinginess, humility over pride, patience over impatience, tolerance over intolerance, forgiveness over holding a grudge, reconciliation over revenge, gentleness over harshness, seeing the best in the other as opposed to seeing the worst, being non-judgmental over being judgmental, understanding over condemnation, giving over taking, blessing over cursing, being polite over being rude, being considerate over being inconsiderate, being kind over being unkind, having an open hand or a closed fist, having an open door policy or a closed door policy, serving those who are excluded or demanding service from them. So you get the picture. You can add your own attributes into what makes a more loving and inclusive person. And if we forget these things and need to be reminded, simply find a loving and inclusive person and watch them. Watch how they act. And then do the same. It's well worth the effort. You really end up feeling better about yourself and feeling better about other people. And it's very, very freeing. And you can get hooked on it. The alternative, excluding others and being hateful, is not that all attractive. It leads to the death of the soul. We remember that Jesus himself, as is written in Matthew's gospel, had this to say: "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And you all know quite well that this same Jesus, after washing his disciples' feet at the Last Supper, told his disciples that they should do the same for each other. And we who follow Jesus in our day and age are also his disciples, and we do well to imitate the Master. Do we choose to include others, or do we choose to exclude them? Do we choose love, or do we choose hate? So I'd like you to repeat these words to me if you believe them to be true. If you don't, it's okay. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I choose inclusion. I choose love. I choose Christ.